The Premier of British Columbia is standing on his head, vowing to stop the increase in the flow of oil from Alberta. At the same time, he is greenlighting the development of LNG in his own province. LNG is considered to be the clean alternative to carbon fuels, and the Premier wants to see an increase in the amount of it produced in BC. When natural gas prices were high back at the early part of the century, the tax revenue from natural gas to the province was substantial. Then, just as it seemed the industry was about to make final investment decisions in the development of large LNG processing facilities in BC, two things happened. First, the market for natural gas was flooded with new discoveries everywhere, and the cost of production in BC soared. In other words, the window of opportunity closed. Energy experts now predict the next supply opportunity window is set to open in 2023. If BC hopes to be a participant in that market, it has to decide now to either go ahead or turn its back on the market. We asked David Keane, the CEO of the BC LNG Alliance, to join us for a conversation that matters on the state of LNG in BC.
Conversations That Matter is a partner program for the Centre for Dialogue at Simon Fraser University. The production of this program is made possible thanks to the support of the following and viewers like you.
Welcome back. You first came and visited us in 2015 when we were taking a look at where LNG was at, and it looked very promising at that time. Since then, we hear news about First Nations that are opposed to it. We hear about environmentalists who say, oh yes, there's this problem and that problem. And then we hear that there are some cancellations and media goes wild and says LNG is dead.
It's a lot more positive than people would think. When we had our last conversation in early 2015, we had at the time 6 members. Today we have 7 members. Even though we lost one member last year who decided to pull out of British Columbia, that was Pacific Northwest. We have the largest LNG companies in the world and some of the largest energy companies in the world that are still very much focused on developing this industry in British Columbia. And there's a number of reasons why. One is our close proximity to the large Asian markets. We're much closer than our biggest competitor, which is the US Gulf Coast. The cold climate gives us about a 25% increase in production capacity. And then you look at the enormous resources that we have available in British Columbia, more than 300 years of gas supply at current demand levels. So unlike other jurisdictions that have supply issues or have political issues, I think we're in a very good position to still be focusing on developing our LNG industry and supplying our natural gas to the large Asian markets. And they'll certainly want to look at how they diversify their supply risk.
So we take a look at Woodfibre LNG, for example. They now have approval on many levels to move forward, and yet still the site sits idle. What's the situation there?
Well, we have to be globally cost competitive. We go back to where we started in say, 2014, 2015. Gas prices were much different in Asia. They were trading at around $17, $18 per million British thermal units. Today, it's come up a bit, so it's probably about $7 or $8 dollars per million British thermal units. So prices changed, and we have to look at how we can become cost competitive. And I think there are 3 things that we need to look at. One is, or actually 3 legs to this stool. One is the proponent's controllable cost. What do they need to do in terms of steel costs, in terms of their EPC, their constructors? All those controllable costs need to be moved down, and they're doing an awful lot of work on actually doing that. Then there's the fiscal policy cost from the provincial side and the federal fiscal policy cost that we have to look at. So if you look at our industry here, there's no other jurisdiction globally that has an LNG income tax, for example. There's also the PST tax, which is a tax that's not rolled through, it's additive. So if I buy something from you at $10 and the PST is 7%, then I've got to add 7% to that to sell it to the next guy. So there's a lot of additional costs that are added onto this, and so we have to be cost competitive.
Right, and we have a carbon tax.
And we have a carbon tax, and there's no other jurisdiction globally outside of Norway, which is not a competitor of ours, that has a price on carbon. Now, to be clear, Stuart, we're not opposed to having a price on carbon. We're not opposed to the $30 per ton carbon price. We do have to figure out on incremental increases to this carbon price how we protect emissions intensive and trade exposed industries. And it's not just LNG, it's mining, it's forestry, it's lumber, it's paper. So all these emissions-intensive industries are going to have to figure out how will we be protected from increases in carbon pricing.
Mm-hmm. Well, you voted against an increase in the carbon tax recently. What was the reasoning behind that?
Well, when I was a member of the climate leadership team, and I don't think this is a secret, I was the only one that voted against the increase in the carbon price. And part of the reason why I did that was the recommendation was to increase carbon prices by $10 a ton beginning in 2018 out to 2050.
With an idea of meeting our climate targets, yes.
And we produce between 65 to 67 million tons of greenhouse gas emissions in British Columbia, which is incidentally about 0.14% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a very small.
So we're not a big contributor. Yeah.
No, we're not. And so and then the goal is to reduce it from the 65 to 67 million tons down to about 12.8 million tons. So increasing it out to 2050 by $10 a ton made the carbon price $380 or so. We still didn't hit the target. So my view was, why are we doing this, creating an awful lot of pain when we're still not hitting our targets? And I think that we have to focus on other areas like transportation and like the built environment.
I just got to get you hang on for a second while we take a quick commercial break. We'll be right back. Sorry for the interruption, but I need your help. I'm asking you to support the show by becoming a patron. That means pledging $1 per show. Conversations is a unique program. There's no grandstanding, no arguing, no yelling. Instead, I sit down with people who have unique insights, specialized knowledge, and experiences that inform and enlighten. And we do this on an incredibly limited budget with a very small crew. Well, this is my office and it's where I edit the show. And then once it's ready, we give it away. You know, so many different websites around the world are carrying the show, but they get it for free. They don't pay us. So I'm asking you to pledge $1 per show by going to patreon.com/conversations that matter. Thanks. We want to keep producing conversations, and with your help, we can. Now let's get back to the show. There are some people who say, no, we have to go back to the producers of the natural resource, gas or oil or whatever, and put the onus on them to help drive down the carbon intensity of these products and whatnot, and it's only through legislation that we can do that. You say, no, we've got to come back around to the end user side of it and look at it from that perspective. Well,
I think it's actually both. I think that the industry itself is recognizing there are things that we need to do, which are, if you look at gas production in northeastern British Columbia, they're looking at how you reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the production fields. And that's converting the production units from diesel to electric. So are there things that can be done there? There is a requirement to reduce fugitive emissions, which is leaking methane, by 45% between now and 2025. If you look at technology, look at some of our plants, you mentioned wood fiber, they'll be all electric and their emissions will be significantly below the industry standard, which is somewhere around 0.22 or 0.23 tons of greenhouse gas emissions divided by tons of LNG produced. LNG Canada, I think, will be at about 0.15. So there's an awful lot that's being done by the industry, but I also think that 80% of emissions come from consumption. Yes. 20% comes from production. So I think we have to figure out how we're going to manage this while still growing the economy and providing jobs. One of the points that I really think is important that we've seen really resonate on our social media is the notion of us selling our natural gas as raw natural gas to the United States. Us not getting the opportunity to add value or get the jobs or the skills training that go along with that. And I think there's this misconception by some folks in BC that if we shut down LNG, we'll shut down gas production. No, we won't shut down gas production. What will happen is we'll become the swing supplier to the United States, who will then take their domestic supply, increase its value, get the jobs and the training opportunities for Americans, and come back to Canada and say, we'll buy your gas for pennies on the dollar.
So not going to stop the flow of gas, but we're going to reduce the amount of money that stays here in British Columbia.
That's right. We'll reduce the amount of money that stays here. We'll reduce royalties. But and also I think it's important to recognize too that our biggest market is becoming our biggest competitor. We used to be 10 or 12 years ago. The U.S. used to buy about 15% of its gas supply from Canada.
Right.
Today, that's around 6%.
Because they had some massive discoveries.
Massive discoveries, just like we have in British Columbia and in Alberta.
Yeah.
Massive shale discoveries. And so we've lost our market share in the south, and it's continuing to go down. But also, we've lost our market share in eastern Canada, which is now being supplied out of the Marcellus Shale out of Pennsylvania. So we're losing our market share, and if we want to see this industry grow and actually prosper and produce the cleanest LNG and cleanest natural gas in the world, then I think we have to find a way to do that, and that's LNG.
So did the Premier's trip to Asia, is that helping, and what do you believe will be the short-term and potentially long-term results of that trade mission?
The fact that the Premier went to Asia is a significant boost for the industry. I think it's a significant show that to the large Asian buyers, whether they're in China, Japan, or Korea, that British Columbia is serious about wanting to develop its LNG resources and become a significant supplier of the product to the big Asian markets.
Were you relieved when the current government continued to, I don't want to say embrace, but support the development of LNG, especially for export?
Well, absolutely. I'm very, very impressed with the Premier. I had conversations with him before the election. He was clear that there were projects that he supports. He also made it clear that there are 4 conditions that he has, which I think we already meet, which is making sure that British Columbians get a good return or get the jobs and the skills training opportunities, make sure that British Columbia gets a fair return for the sale of its resource, make sure that we protect the environment, and then also working closely with and benefiting First Nations.
Well, there's 2 things there, excuse me, that I want to touch on. One is skills development, and the second is First Nations. Frequently, I'm left with the impression that First Nations communities throughout British Columbia have almost a natural opposition to the delivery of LNG or gas via pipelines to the processing plants through their territories. And yet then I come across the First Nations LNG Alliance that says, no, that's not the case. What exactly is the story there?
Well, I think it's important too, and it's also important to point out that the First Nations LNG Alliance is in no way related or associated with the BC LNG Alliance. They are completely an independent organization that was created by First Nations for First Nations. And I think what they're looking for, and I can't speak for them, but is making sure that projects are developed in a sustainable fashion, which we absolutely agree with. Make sure that First Nations communities get reliable, accurate information from First Nations about the development of the industry, whether it's LNG or whether it's hydraulic fracturing and the production of the natural gas. And then also making sure that First Nations and Indigenous people have real long-term economic opportunities as a result of these facilities.
When we take a look at the change that follows the Silcoteen decision a couple of years ago, it puts them in a position where they can benefit financially from the transportation of gas through their territories.
Well, I also think that it's the right thing to do. It's the right thing to make sure that you're working closely with your partners that are going to be in close proximity to these facilities, whether the pipelines or the gas production facilities or the LNG facilities themselves. And contrary to what people might read in the press or what you might hear from various pundits, we have a tremendous amount of support. I think about 92 to 94 or 3% of First Nations communities in British Columbia support the development of this industry.
Well, I was watching a presentation by Ellis Ross recently where he was starting to get frustrated by people who were misrepresenting First Nations position and also trying to hijack First Nations name, I guess, or community names for other purposes. It seems to be a real concern. Is it something that stands in the way? Because, and I bring this up because I think about the Kinder Morgan project. It looked like it had met all of those requirements, and still there's this ongoing opposition. Are you worried that there are, going to be, no matter where you get to, there's going to be somebody else who's going to come along and say, yes, but you can't do this?
Having a strong working relationship with your communities, whether it's the local community or the local First Nations community, is extremely important. I think having local First Nations chiefs be able to stand up and say, no, wait a minute, we support the development of this industry. And here's why. There's environmental benefits. There's economic opportunities that First Nations wouldn't have received had it not been for this industry. And I think if you talk to First Nations along the coast that are particularly in the Haisla territory and Kitimat, they are very supportive of developing their LNG facilities.
So the other point that you brought up was skills development. And we identified this a couple of years ago when we talked. What has been happening from an educational and a training perspective that if, let's say, especially LNG Canada announces that they're going to make their final investment decision and move forward, how do we ensure that they're going to have the workforce that's going to allow them to, number one, build that facility, but more importantly, run it for a long time?
We've been a part of what used to be called the Premier's LNG Working Group from the very beginning. Today it's a Workforce Development Advisory Council. And think about what it meant. We had proponents, LNG proponents there, the pipeline proponents were there, organized labor was there, the building trades, the BC Fed, First Nations communities were present and participating, all of us participating in a discussion around how are we going to develop the industry and how are we going to make sure that we as the LNG industry live up to what we've said, which is to hire locals first, British Columbians and then Canadians, and then look outside the country for temporary foreign workers. And our goal is to make sure that we start looking at how we train people so that, and what we've done is we've supplied the government with the skills that are going to be required to build a large LNG facility.
So what are those skills?
Welders, electricians, boiler makers, carpenters, cement masons. I mean, there's a number of folks that are going to have to be available to be able to build this industry. So making sure that we've identified, here's the skills that are going to be required, the government looking at what skills are currently available in BC and then what skills are available in Canada, looking at the gaps, and then how do you fill the gaps?
How big do you expect this workforce to be if, let's say, 2 or 3 projects move forward?
Each large plant will take somewhere between 4,000 to 7,000 construction workers at peak.
Right.
And then the pipeline will take an additional 3,000 or so to build the pipeline. So there will be substantial job opportunities for British Columbians. And I think if you go back to a report that was done by the Conference Board of Canada in early 2016, they said that if we build a what I would consider to be a modest LNG industry in BC of 30 million tons, and they broke that out to be 2 large plants and 1 small one, that would represent every year for 30 years, $3 billion of incremental revenue to the BC government, $5.4 billion in GDP, $7.4 billion to the federal GDP, and 65,000 jobs across the nation every year for 30 years. These are new incremental jobs. And also now you think about $3 billion. Well, what does $3 billion buy BC? You know, it buys them 2,500 new nurses every year for 30 years. It buys them 2,500 new teachers every year for 30 years. It buys them 900 new doctors every year for 30 years, 60 new elementary schools every year for 30 years, and finally, a new patellar bridge every year for 30 years. That's what the LNG industry has to offer in terms of economics to British Columbia.
Our main market is still going to be Asia, especially as we watch a global economy shift that way. Everybody wants in on Asia, and so we've got competition. We've got Russia, we've got Australia, the United States is a competitor, and so on. How important is it that we move now, or do we have a longer runway than many people had envisioned?
Well, we missed the first window of opportunity. We were not cost competitive. And so the next window of opportunity is when we expect demand to exceed supply is around 2023.
Well, it's not so far away.
No, it's not
especially
far away.
When you consider the amount of time that it would take to come online.
Right, it takes 4 to 5 years to build one of these large facilities. So I think having final investment decisions this year and next year, and maybe even 2020, would be very, very positive. And I think that's why there's still an awful lot of interest in developing this industry in BC. Again, you look at supply risk out of certain areas like Australia, Eastern Australia, that weren't there 4 or 5 years ago. Look at the political risk out of the Middle East now that wasn't there just 2 years ago in terms of Qatar and Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
the fact that Russia already supplies about 10% of China's gas demand, how much more does China want to buy from Russia, given Russia's proclivity to hold countries ransom in terms of their gas supply? So there's an awful lot of reasons why these large Asian markets are going to want to focus on BC and Canada as a long-term stable supplier of natural resources.
So we see China moving away from the use of coal for power generation.
Yes.
And as it does so, do you anticipate that we're going to see this increase in demand for natural gas?
They're replacing coal with gas-fired power generation. They're replacing coal with renewables.
Yes.
And it's important to recognize that there is a role for renewables in the growing economies of Asia and also around the world. But also, there's also a recognition that as you grow renewables, in order to make sure you balance your electrical systems, you're going to need rapid starting gas-fired power plants, in addition to replacing coal. And it's important to recognize too that if we replace coal with natural gas, that we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions on a life cycle basis by about 50 to 55%. So, and also recognize too that we will be producing the world's cleanest LNG. So
that's a bold statement. How do we make that statement and be able to stand behind it?
Well, if you look at LNG Canada, I mean, the world today, I'd say the average is probably around 0.22 to 0.23 in terms of the intensity factor for greenhouse gas emissions versus tons of LNG produced annually. If you look at our plants here, we have the mandated, legislated by law intensity benchmark of 0.16. So we have to meet that. And if you don't meet that, then you have to pay an additional amount above the carbon tax in buying carbon offsets or investing in a tech fund.
So there's an incentive to do that.
So there's an incentive to do that. Plus, if you look at a couple of our members that are looking at final investment decisions this year, Wood Fibre and LNG Canada, they both exceed or are below that 0.16 in terms of greenhouse gas intensity. You look at what's going on in the upstream and conversion, or looking at converting diesel-powered production facilities to all electric, reducing fugitive gas methane emissions by up to 45% between now and 2025. So we will absolutely have the world's cleanest LNG. And if you're concerned about global warming and concerned about greenhouse gas emissions, then you should be supportive of us producing our natural gas in British Columbia, liquefying it and selling it to the big Asian markets.
So how confident are you that we'll see some of those final investment decisions this year so that we can be in a position to capitalize on that next window of opportunity, as you pointed out, which is in 2023?
I'm very confident. I think that we have, again, contrary to what people might be hearing in the press or from various pundits, we have a supportive provincial government. We also have a very supportive federal government. We have supportive First Nations. We have supportive local communities. So I think that all the stars are being aligned to actually have positive final investment decisions this year and also next or the year after as well.
So it looks like it's a positive future ahead of us right at the moment based on our conversation, and I hope that you're right. Thank you,
Stuart, thank
ever
you
so
very
much
much
for bringing us up to speed. And the depth of information that you brought to this conversation was very helpful.
Thank you very much for having me.